Just got a question from the audience. Jay Costley is here in the audience on my live stream. He's appeared on this channel before in interviews and discussions. Jay is asking to what extent veganism as an identity is something determined by vegans themselves. Now, I think what he has in mind is the simple question is, are you vegan simply because you identify as vegan? Is anyone who claims to be vegan, therefore ipso facto vegan? But I view the question and the problem in a bit more of a culturally complex context. What does it mean to be vegan? I've been in a scenario in Taiwan where, in the context of traditional Taiwanese culture, Taiwanese Chinese culture, Buddhist culture, Confucian culture, miscellaneous Chinese ancestor worship, religious and supernatural beliefs, when I identified myself as vegan, people perceived me with a certain kind of snide contempt, and they wanted to ask one way or another, do you really believe in ghosts? Now, to some of you watching this video, that may seem completely surreal. What does veganism have to do with believing in ghosts? Well, in Taiwanese culture, one has quite a lot to do with the other. Many of the people you meet who've become vegan in Taiwan believe in karma in one form or another, and they may really live their lives in fear of the dead, of dead people, ghosts being entities that make decisions that have real impacts on their lives. And belief is kind of easy to talk about. In that context, it's often a lot more useful to talk about fear. Fear of ghosts, fear of the dead, fear of bad karma, etc. Because when people fear these things and change their lives accordingly, that's a very sure sign of how real the role of belief is in their lives. One anecdote I had from a friend was of a young woman who got pregnant. She and her boyfriend had an accidental pregnancy, and they looked at the calendar and they actually delayed having the abortion until a date on the calendar that they felt was less likely to result in the ghost of the fetus haunting them. This is telling about Buddhist morality in many ways. They do regard abortion as bad karma, as an act of violence, and as something that will produce a ghost. But they're actually responding to that challenge by trying to kind of negotiate with this supernatural cosmology and choose a lucky date on the calendar. But those are people who really believe in ghosts, who really fear ghosts. So in that cultural context, when I identify as vegan, I may think of veganism as something very strongly linked to ecology, very strongly linked to a political discourse that I come on YouTube and talk about. But the identity people are going to impose on me reflects a set of cultural assumptions I have no control over. Now, maybe Taiwan is a little bit too exotic and bizarre for you watching this video. Some people are going to be familiar with it, some not, obviously. Probably I have some regular viewers on this channel who are here because they know about my background in Asian studies and Asian languages. But for some of you, that's a little bit hard to imagine. Let me tell you, in France, which is not nearly so exotic, living in France, when you tell people that you're vegan, they have a lot of political assumptions about who you are and what you believe. And they will often have the same kind of religious assumptions about who you are and what you believe, where they will perceive you as someone with supernatural, cult-like beliefs as being the only explanation for why you'd be vegan. And that stereotype is obviously not without a basis. So I think that's part of the reason why there is so much self-policing of the identity within veganism. Self-policing is too vague. I've got to explain what I mean here. I see a lot of irrational behavior on the internet of vegans basically castigating and beating up other vegans because they're really afraid if this behavior is perceived as normal within veganism, if whatever the behavior is they're trying to perceive, then other people will associate that with veganism. Now, that can be true even of lazy veganism. I mean, it can be true even with the fear that, look, if other people think it's okay to eat honey, or if other people think it's okay to, eat milk ingredients as long as they're invisible or something like that. If there's somebody who's a lazy vegan, describing themselves as veganism, describing what they do as veganism, describing themselves as vegan, that will have knock-on effects for how veganism is perceived, how they themselves as a vegan are perceived, that this will actually pollute the definition of veganism. That's a little bit simple and straightforward. But you see the same kind of behavior kind of telescoping out into questions of, what is the connection between veganism and the so-called anti-vax movement? So that's hysteria about possible and actual side effects from vaccines. So in many cases, the side effects they're talking about are real, but they're 1 in a million. And that 1 in a million side effect is being used to justify an anti-medical establishment position refusing to accept vaccines. Well, in the recent past, I'd say just 2 years ago, there was a very, very strong connection that you could see on the internet all the time, or very significant overlap between the public face of veganism and the public face of the anti-vaxxers. There's a so-called crunchy mom phenomenon. I think 10 years from now, nobody's going to remember the term crunchy mom, but on the internet, that was a big deal just 2 years ago. And there were all these people on all these message boards putting together information. And, the same people who would put together these kind of crazy semi-scientific excuses for condemning vaccines would at the same time be putting together crazy semi-scientific excuses for why, if you were vegan, you didn't really need to take a B12 supplement. And you do. Scientifically, you really do need to take a B12 supplement. Even the meat eaters should all be taking B12 supplements in terms of what science tells us. But you can understand why vegans get into trying to police the identity internally. Vegans beating up on and censoring other vegans. Because of this fear, if we let this pass, if we let this become normal, if we let this become publicly perceived as normal in veganism, then that's going to come back to haunt us. So the original question was, is the identity of veganism something 100% determined and controlled by ourselves as vegans, or is it partly determined by perception, by public perception? I think the tragedy we're all stuck with is that it's 100% determined by public perception when it really matters. And when does it really matter? It matters when you're in a prison cell and you're trying to explain to the jailer that you can't eat any of the food you've been given. It matters when you're a parent in France and your child is required by the school authorities to eat meat. That's a requirement that at lunch they're served meat. And as a parent, you don't have the right to refuse, and maybe the principal calls you up and explains this to you, or the principal calls in a doctor, and the doctor informs you as a vegan that it's impossible for your child to get enough protein if they don't eat meat and cheese, this kind of thing. When you're dealing with people in positions of authority, the way they perceive you, their assumptions about you because you're vegan, and their assumptions about veganism that may indeed, directly or indirectly be based on the cast of crazy eccentrics who managed to get in the limelight here on the internet, or it may be based on, for example, animal rights terrorists, as it was for many decades in Europe. A small number of people who used violence really destroyed the reputation of animal rights, just as a term. Animal rights as a term had to be decided. Destroyed the reputation of the anti-fur movement because of its link to violence. And I do think to a significant extent, in the last 10 years, veganism has had an uphill struggle precisely because of the reputation earned by small numbers of headline-grabbing violent protesters. So no, sadly, 0% of it is under our control. What's under our control is our diet. What's under our control is our ability to organize ourselves politically to accomplish real things through real activism. But public perception, it can be terrifying. It can be especially terrifying when you're talking about the perception of people who are in a role of authority over you to control your life, to control your child's life at the prison, at the school, at the retirement home, at the hospital. And those already are really good reasons for why veganism must be articulated as a political struggle, not just as a diet, not just as a form of personal purity, and indeed not just as an ecological or animal rights movement, but ultimately as a movement for vegans themselves as a visible minority living within Western democratic societies.